Jarek, really appreciate the introduction. That means a lot coming from you, and hopefully I'll live up to those high expectations. So I'm going to be sharing from my screen right now. So let me pop that up. All right, and Jarek, please stop me if you cannot see my screen. But otherwise, I'm going to assume that everyone can see
You're good,
managing
man.
risk in an AI-powered future. So just a quick upfront, why should you care? So I've got 4 headlines that I've grabbed here that some of you may have heard of over the past year or so, but I'll just go through some of the key issues that I'm going to be discussing today. So in the top left, I'm going to drill down into the specific scenario, but basically a car dealership integrated an AI-powered chatbot into their sales and customer support process, and they kind of had a big surprise, which I'll touch on a little bit. In the top right, ChatGPT, some security researchers found that it was possible to force it to regurgitate some of its training data verbatim just by making it repeat a single word forever. So pretty simple attack vector that can have some serious impacts. In the bottom left, I'll touch on this a little bit later in the presentation, but Zoom had a little bit of a public relations snafu when they made some changes to their terms of service as they relate to AI training. And then in the bottom right, ChatGPT has been in the news a lot, but it's also been in the eyes of regulators quite a bit. So I'll talk about some of the compliance and security and, compliance and privacy implications of using AI. So you've probably heard a lot about security and AI or AI governance. I'm going to drill down and discuss explicitly what I mean and what I'm going to be talking about today. In the bottom left, you've got AI for security, which is certainly a vibrant and growing field. So that's compliance automation, SOC automation, things like that. That's awesome. On the right, you've got AI for hacking. That could be ethical hackers who are doing red teaming, pen testing, but it also could be criminals who are doing phishing emails using generative AI. And then up top, with a little bit of overlap of the other 2 fields, you've got security for AI, and that's what this presentation is going to be about. So just at a high level, I'm going to touch on 7 things. You don't need to worry about memorizing all these. I'm going to go way in depth, but this is just a roadmap for this conversation. All right, so number 1, developing clear business and security requirements. Interestingly enough, this is not a security team responsibility, in my opinion. This is a business leader responsibility. And I'll give you an example. So I alluded to this a little bit before, but the Chevy dealership rolled out this GPT-powered chatbot, and immediately people on the internet, as they do, started tearing it apart. And in this situation, a user was able to get it to agree to a sale of a Chevy Tahoe for $1. Now, from a business perspective, if you're selling cars for $1, I'm pretty sure that's going to be a unacceptable hit to your bottom line. So this is not a trivial issue, and this is not just a joke, because recently in Canada, Air Canada was sued by a customer on very similar grounds, where an AI chatbot had told the customer certain things about its policies. The customer operated on the belief that the chatbot was correct, and when it turned out it wasn't, he ended up suing the airline, and he won. And the airline or the judge forced the airline to honor the terms that had been put forward by the chatbot. So understanding whether this is a big deal or not, that's a key business and security requirement. So what should your AI application be able to do? What should it not be able to do? What level of deviation from those requirements can you accept? What are your reputation and branding constraints? If you've got something like Grok, which is on X, formerly known as Twitter, it has a fun mode where people understand that it's being snarky and a little bit edgy. But is that in alignment with your brand? Maybe you're a very conservative and kind of staid brand that doesn't want to have any sarcasm or anything like that. And then what are your contractual obligations? What are your relationships with your customers? Is it going to be kind of a transactional sale of a good, or is it going to be a longer term engagement or consulting or B2B relationship where you're going to be much more closely integrated, and you're going to have much deeper negotiations with your customers and your partners. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to be going through some milestones along the way about how you can grade yourself where you are in this process. And I won't read over everyone because the slides will be available, but kind of at the most basic level, all requirements will be communicated informally, either verbally or just via email or Slack. And the security team's not really going to be involved in development, or it doesn't exist. As you get a little more advanced, you'll be documenting these requirements in something like Jira or Asana, whatever your system of record is, and you'll have affirmative descriptions of what the model should and shouldn't do, or the application should or shouldn't do. And then you'll have maybe a security gate before release that'll give you a thumbs up, thumbs down before you release. At the most sophisticated level, you're going to be having specific confidentiality, integrity, and availability requirements that are communicated from product management. So, it may be acceptable that your chatbot recommends a competitor every 1,000th time, every 1,000th interaction. That could be acceptable. However, you might say if you've got a AI system that is interacting with protected health information, it may be never acceptable for the application to provide that information to an individual who is not under an obligation of confidentiality and a business associate agreement. So those could be some business and security requirements. And then you're also integrating security and engineering throughout the entire process and doing post-release penetration testing to make sure that you're preventing model drift and things like that. Okay, next up is identifying your privacy and compliance needs. I touch on this because, on the left, I alluded to OpenAI is under all sorts of regulatory scrutiny, both in the EU and the United States. I've counted at least 3 GDPR-related investigations from multiple data protection authorities in Europe, and the FTC is apparently investigating it due to a data breach that it had in early 2023 and some inaccurate responses that the tool is providing. So some key things to look at. What are your breach notification requirements? If you're in the United States and you operate in multiple states, every state has a data breach notification law, so understand what those are. What frameworks do you need to follow for regulatory or contractual reasons? Or more importantly, what do you claim, or equally importantly, what do you claim that you're following? I'll touch on that a little bit in the communication section. Are you handling PHI, or are you classifying data by the handling requirements? What are your customer obligations in terms of protecting data from a confidentiality, integrity, and availability perspective? And then are you subject to some of these overarching data protection regulations? Some things to look at from a maturity level are, at the most basic perspective, you don't have any sort of privacy policy, or you just kind of have a completely boilerplate one. You're training AI models indiscriminately on personally identifiable information, protected health information, hopefully not in that case, or personal data under the European Union GDPR, or potentially you're not segregating your retrieval augmented generation pipelines or processes using a logical based approach. You may be just providing a whole set of database rows to an application and saying, have at it, provide the right information to the user. Hopefully it works. So as you become more sophisticated, you'll have policies tailored to the jurisdictions and your specific use cases. You'll be redacting or removing or preventing the introduction of sensitive data into training or RAG pipelines to prevent unanticipated or undesirable exposure. And then the most sophisticated organizations will have automated processes for all their contingencies, whether it's a right to be forgotten, data subject access request, things like that. And then data will be classified using automated tagging. So rules-based enforcement will prevent unauthorized release. You won't rely on humans to make decisions about what data to provide to a model or to provide externally. You'll have a logical approach that will make it much more difficult for things to fail. Okay, moving along, we've got publishing and enforcing an AI policy. So some reasons why you might want to do this are because these two organizations, both Samsung and Amazon, reportedly, again, there's no confirmation, this is just in the press, but had employees that were using ChatGPT, presumably in its default training mode, and they were providing it sensitive data regarding the internal operations of the company. And at least in the case of Amazon, it appears that ChatGPT learned based on some of this information that it was given and was able to provide very convincing and accurate responses to technical questions about Amazon's internal architecture and infrastructure. So to avoid that, I would advise having an AI policy. So some key things to think about are avoiding blanket bans, because these will likely lead to shadow AI, which I'll talk about a little bit in the next module. And in the background, you can see this is what Midjourney thinks a shadow AI is. It's a big scary robot hiding in the corner, hiding under your bed. Also involving the right stakeholders to make sure you have contributions from all the right experts is key, although we'll talk about accountability in a little bit. Consider other policies that need modification, such as acceptable use, incident response, vulnerability management. These are all things that probably need a hard look if you're integrating AI tools into your tech stack. Also clearly documenting your risk appetite and tolerance using the policy. Be specific about what's acceptable and what is not. Some other recommendations are to avoid paper tigers. And again, this is Midjourney's depiction of what a paper tiger looks like. And these are policies that aren't enforced or aren't even enforceable. These are things that are vague or are not actionable, and I would recommend avoiding them. Additionally, in terms of accountability, I would say having business leaders own the policy and risk acceptance procedure will make sure you don't get into strange situations where security teams are trying to figure out, what are the revenue implications here? What are the technological or competitive implications of allowing or disallowing this type of decision or tool? Because they're frankly not well equipped to make those types of calls. It's business leaders who need to balance all of the organizational risks, who in my opinion should be making these types of tough decisions. And then also understanding your AI exposure in your supply chain is a very important aspect of this process, and make sure your policy accounts for not just your organization, but your vendors and potentially even their vendors, getting into fourth party risk. So in terms of maturity, some things to look at the most basic level, it's the Wild West. You'll have lots of unintended training like Amazon and Samsung reportedly faced. A more developed organization will have a policy in place, potentially with the security team owning risk acceptance and things like that. And the most sophisticated organizations will be very explicit in their policy. Folks will say that policies shouldn't be, they should be high level, and I agree, but they shouldn't be vague. They should be clear about who owns what responsibility and where to look, which procedures, registers, standards. You should look for additional guidance. And then the business will be making those risk acceptance decisions. All right, moving along to maintaining an AI asset inventory. I talked about shadow AI a little bit, and in my opinion, if you've got the same risk or same vulnerability, I'd much rather know about it than not know about it. And if you've got shadow AI, where you have employees that are using tools on their own, maybe even on their own accounts, not even on organizational accounts, then you are going to be very hard pressed to manage the associated risk of that AI use. So some recommendations that I would have are keeping a single source of truth for all company assets. Building a comprehensive asset inventory is a challenge for organizations. I know that. And when you add AI into the mix, it gets even more challenging. This should include SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS deployments. And even if you're doing things truly on premises, include those. And some additional items that you can include are trust boundaries. Are you authenticating when you're communicating with these systems? What sort of data classifications are you providing to them? And then if you are concerned about GDPR compliance, then what is the sub-processor status of these organizations? Where are they located? things of that nature. You can depict these all in a single source of truth. My opinion is that the Cyclone DX software bill of materials format is flexible enough to do all of these things. And then you can provide different views based on different stakeholders' needs, depending on what they need to see. So getting into maturity here, when you're just starting out, you're probably not going to have any inventory at all, and people will just kind of spin up new systems, new tools at will. As you get a little more advanced, you'll have a spreadsheet-based inventory, but there will probably be little transparency about the supply chain. So what is the training data of these systems that you're using? And then as you get more sophisticated, you'll have a single source of truth with different views for those different stakeholders, and you'll be able to document data lineage, things of that nature. That will increasingly become a regulatory requirement for things like the European Union's AI Act, the final text of which has been released recently. And then you'll also be able to update the inventory on an automated basis rather than a manual one as the most sophisticated type of organization. All right, standard operating procedures is number 5 out of 7. So if you don't have a standard operating procedure and you have some sort of incident, then really this is going to be your set of choices that you have. You can panic or you can panic. So to avoid that, what I would recommend is having detailed sets of workflows, run books, whatever you want to call them, for how to deal with different types of situations. So some key things to focus on: incident response, decommissioning, classifying new data, bringing on new tools, managing vulnerabilities in AI systems. You can use generalist tools to help accelerate this process, or AI security specific ones, or your existing GRC workflows. What you have on the right of the screen is a snapshot from StackAware's AI risk management standard operating procedure. And this gets into quite a bit of detail with respect to, what are the various timelines, who are the stakeholders. These are color coded by organizations. So for example, red is security, purple is the business leader, green and yellow are legal and privacy respectively. So these are all things that will definitely behoove you to have documented ahead of time. So in terms of maturity, the most basic organization will just have no SOPs documented, and it'll be a fire drill every time you have a new issue to deal with. There'll be senior leaders that assemble either in a virtual or physical war room, so to speak, and people will kind of be flying from the seat of their pants. As you get a little more developed, you'll have documented SOPs for key use cases, and you'll have decision-making criteria associated with those different points. And you'll also do some training. Now, the most sophisticated organizations will have their procedures documented as code and be able to have automated execution of these things with humans overseeing the decisions at key points to make sure that things aren't going off the rails. And then you'll do unannounced exercises to confirm employee understanding. All right. So moving on to external communication, this is module 6 out of 7. I alluded to this a little bit earlier. Something that is quite interesting is this is a screenshot from the Security and Exchange Commission's complaint against the company SolarWinds. This isn't specific to AI, but it's a generalizable point. So the SEC had some issues with how SolarWinds was explaining its security posture externally, specifically with respect to what the SEC calls the NIST framework. And now SolarWinds had a quite good response to the SEC on their website, which is linked at the bottom here, pointing out that potentially the SEC wasn't exactly clear on the differences between things like the NIST cybersecurity framework and the NIST 853 set of controls. So the lesson here is that you should be able to go to the mat with a regulator and explain and convince a judge that you are upholding certain standards if you are claiming to do so. So you will need to be able to defend your statements about your AI security posture. So how will you respond to security questionnaires? Will you have a trust center where you let people self-serve to get this information? What will your terms and conditions look like? So this is something that I alluded to with respect to Zoom. So they changed their terms and conditions somewhat stealthily in early 2023. And then the changes didn't surface until a security researcher pointed them out about 6 months later. And then Zoom faced a whole firestorm of bad press because it had claimed the right to do some very aggressive things when it came to artificial intelligence training on user data. In fact, it turned out they weren't even doing things that I would consider to be that outlandish, but the mere way in which they rolled out the changes and the expansive nature of what they claimed to be able to do with your data was quite jarring for a lot of people and caused a lot of blowback. And then on a related note, for those who are making SEC filings, not an attorney by any stretch of the imagination, but think hard about how you're going to describe your AI use. Being appropriately specific, while at the same time not opening yourself up to malicious actors who might be scanning those reports looking for potential vulnerabilities. So in terms of external communication, the most basic organizations, startups, will probably not have any sort of communication about this. There'll be a boilerplate policy with no mention of sub-processors or retention practices. But as you get more advanced, you'll start talking about your AI usage, potentially more on the marketing side. This is a great way for me to identify potential StackAware clients is when I see the marketing team is talking a lot about AI on their blogs, but they don't have a lot of it documented in their trust center. That's usually a sign that it's time for me to jump in. And then you'll have internal ad hoc processes for responding to inquiries about AI, but not a procedure in place, so to speak. The most advanced organizations will have basically no daylight between their internal and external communications. The internal communications might be more detailed, but the external communications will perfectly reflect the accuracy of those internal communications. And then I think it's a best practice to have a self-service trust center and provide as much information as you are able to publicly about your AI usage and be explicit in your terms and conditions how you are using AI and how you're retaining customer data that is being processed. All right, on the home stretch here. Number 7 is to audit and improve. So some key standards that are of note for organizations are things like the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, which was published in early 2023. A new standard called ISO/IEC 42001, which is focused on AI management systems. That was released at the end of 2023. My company is going through the audit process right now. Kind of older or more familiar standards for information security folks might be ISO 27001, and now ISO is releasing some additional documents, 90 and 91 in that series, that are going to discuss AI-specific security and privacy implications. So these are good sources of guidance. You can't be audited against those specific documents, but you can against 27001 and 42001. Some additional best practices are to develop automated ways of checking compliance with occasional manual oversight, and then not moving on from incidents without a root cause analysis. That will help you understand the underlying issues that have contributed to an AI-related incident and help avoid them in the future. And that's a requirement of ISO 42001. So in terms of how sophisticated you might be, at the most basic level, you'll have no auditing in terms of policy compliance, because there are no policies, so you can't really audit compliance with them. There'll be no RCAs after incidents. You'll just be moving from fire to fire, and the leadership team will just be making subjective decisions about disciplinary issues and whether to hold someone accountable or not. A more advanced organization will do occasional root cause analyses, but follow-up will be ad hoc. There'll be some internal auditing and compliance, and maybe you'll start pursuing external certification or attestation. And then the most sophisticated teams will do an RCA after every instance of non-compliance. They'll rapidly update their procedures and retrain folks who don't understand what their jobs are. Automating the AI governance requirements that you have is another key internal improvement place. So doing patching, prompt blocking, whatever your security and business requirements are, implementing those in an automated way is a sure sign of improvement, and you will likely be able to have some sort of external attestation or certification of your AI governance and security program at this step. Okay, so we're coming to the end of my presentation here. I have a bunch of free resources that are freely available, so feel free to check these out. When you navigate to this slide deck, which you'll get as part of the resources after the session, you'll be able to navigate to all these links. Please follow me on LinkedIn and X to get some daily content related to AI governance and security. And then if you still have any questions, feel free to reach out directly to StackAware. So with that, that wraps up my session. Happy to take any questions.